I never intended to end up at the edge of the world. But when you're running on fumes, a depleted bank account, and a past you'd rather keep strictly in the rearview mirror, you don't exactly get the luxury of being picky. That's how I found myself staring at the flickering neon sign of O'Connor's Outpost, a combined gas station, diner, and supply store, sitting like a lonely island of yellow light in the vast, suffocating ocean of the Pacific Northwest. The outpost was located at the very edge of the Blackwood Ridge National Forest. The nearest actual town was a grueling 45-mile drive down a winding, unlit mountain highway that felt more like a tunnel through the pines than a road. The trees out here didn't just grow, they loomed. Massive Douglas firs and ancient redwoods that looked like they had been standing since the dawn of time, their branches thick and heavy, absorbing the light and sound of anything that dared to pass by. It was 10:30 p.m. on a Tuesday when I pulled my beat-up sedan into the gravel lot for my first graveyard shift. The rain was coming down in a relentless, freezing drizzle, turning the gravel into a muddy soup. The diner looked exactly as you'd expect: aged wooden siding, large front windows coated in a thin layer of condensation, and an interior bathed in the hum of flickering fluorescent lights. A bell chimed cheerfully as I pushed the heavy glass door open, the sound starkly contrasting the heavy dread sitting in my stomach. The air inside smelled of stale coffee, pine sol, and old grease. Behind the counter stood Arthur O'Connor, the owner. He was a man who looked like he had been carved out of the very mountains that surrounded us. Deeply lined face, eyes the color of slate, and a posture that suggested he carried a weight much heavier than the boxes of inventory he was currently stacking. "Elias," he grunted, not looking up from the box of sugar packets. "You're late. By 4 minutes." "Weather's rough out there," I offered, shaking the rain from my jacket. "The fog is so thick you could carve it with a knife." Arthur finally stopped and looked at me. His gaze was unnervingly intense, evaluating me in a way that made me feel like I was being x-rayed. "The weather is the least of your concerns out here, son. This isn't a city convenience store. Out here, the woods press right up against the glass. You need to understand the isolation." "I can handle quiet," I said, moving behind the counter to grab the apron he tossed to me. I needed a job that didn't require me to talk to 100 people an hour. "You'll get quiet," Arthur replied, his voice dropping an octave. "Sometimes too much of it. But when the quiet breaks, that's when you need to pay attention." He reached beneath the cash register and pulled out a single sheet of heavily laminated paper. It was yellowed at the edges, the text typed out on what must have been a vintage typewriter. He slapped it onto the laminate counter between us. "These are the rules," Arthur said, his tone devoid of any humor. "I don't care what you believe in. I don't care if you think it's a joke, a hazing ritual for the new guy, or the ramblings of an old mountain man. You follow them to the letter. If you don't, you won't just lose your job, you'll lose a hell of a lot more." I looked down at the paper. O'Connor's Outpost, Night Shift Protocol. Rule 1. The diner is open 24/7. However, if the bell for Pump 4 rings after 2 a.m., absolutely do not look out the front windows. Keep your eyes on the counter. Press the intercom button and say clearly, "Pump 4 is out of order. Please use another." Do not apologize. Do not look up until you hear heavy footsteps walk away. Rule 2. At some point, a park ranger named Miller might come in for coffee. He will look entirely normal. Look closely at the badge on his chest. If the bear on the badge is missing its eyes, do not unlock the door. Go to the kitchen and turn on the exhaust fan until he leaves. The real Miller died in these woods 6 years ago. Whatever is wearing his face is still learning how to get the details right. Rule 3. If you hear someone calling your name from the tree line, even if it sounds exactly like me, your mother, or someone you love, turn on the exterior floodlights immediately. Do not step off the porch. They steal voices. They use them like bait. Rule 4. Never let the coffee pots go completely empty. The smell of fresh coffee covers the scent of human sweat. They have an incredible sense of smell. Rule 5. If the woods ever go completely, perfectly silent, no wind, no crickets, no hum of the highway, hide in the walk-in freezer. Wait for the sound of scratching on the metal door to stop, then count to 100 before coming out. I read the list twice, waiting for the punchline. I looked up at Arthur, a nervous smile twitching at the corner of my mouth. Okay, very funny. You really went all out for the spooky cabin in the woods vibe. Arthur didn't smile back. He didn't even blink. He reached across the counter, his calloused hand gripping my wrist with surprising ironclad strength. "Look at my eyes, Elias," he whispered, the absolute sincerity in his voice sending a sudden chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the rain outside. There are things in the Blackwood Ridge that science hasn't categorized yet. Things that have been here long before the highway was paved, long before the logging camps. They mimic us, they study us, and they are always hungry. Follow the damn rules. He let go of my wrist, grabbed his heavy wool coat, and walked out the door without another word. The bell chimed, the door clicked shut, and suddenly the silence of the outpost crashed down on me like a physical weight. I was alone. The first 3 hours of the shift were agonizingly mundane, lulling me into a false sense of security. I wiped down the formica tables, restocked the napkin dispensers, and brewed a fresh pot of dark roast, making sure to follow Rule 4, if only to humor the crazy old man. Around midnight, an 18-wheeler pulled into the lot. The hiss of air brakes broke the silence, and a burly, exhausted-looking trucker named Dale came in. He ordered a black coffee and a slice of cherry pie. We chatted briefly about the treacherous road conditions and the heavy fog that was beginning to blanket the highway. He was normal, a baseline of reality that made the laminated list of rules sitting next to the register feel incredibly silly. "Drive safe out there," I told him as he paid his tab. "You too, kid," Dale replied, gesturing to the dark windows. "Creepy out here tonight. Keep the doors locked." After Dale's rig rumbled away into the fog, the isolation returned, thicker than before. The fog outside had thickened to the point where I could barely see the gas pumps. They stood like skeletal sentinels in the swirling white mist. I checked the clock on the wall, 1:45 a.m. I poured myself a mug of coffee and leaned against the counter, reading a paperback novel I had brought along to pass the time. The rhythmic hum of the refrigerators and the steady patter of rain against the roof became a hypnotic lullaby. My eyelids began to droop. I was convincing myself that Arthur O'Connor was just a paranoid eccentric who spent too much time breathing in pine fumes. Then the digital clock clicked over to 2:02 a.m. Ding, ding! The electronic chime above the register sliced through the silence. It was the notification for the gas pumps. I glanced at the small digital display on the console. Pump 4, assistance required. My heart gave a sudden, violently hard thump against my ribs. I froze, my coffee mug halfway to my mouth. The outpost was completely silent. I hadn't heard a car pull up. I hadn't seen any headlights cut through the fog. The gravel outside was loud. You could hear a vehicle approaching from a mile away. But there had been nothing. Just the chime. Rule 1. If the bell for Pump 4 rings after 2 a.m., absolutely do not look out the front windows. "It's just a glitch," I muttered to myself, my voice sounding incredibly small in the empty diner. "Old wiring, the rain is shorting out the sensor." Ding, ding! It rang again. Sharper this time, more insistent. My eyes darted downward, gluing themselves to the worn, scratched surface of the counter. My pulse was a frantic drumbeat in my ears. The urge to look up, to peer through the rain-streaked glass and see who or what was standing by Pump 4 was nearly overpowering. It is a fundamental human instinct to look toward the unknown, to visually confirm a threat. Fighting that instinct felt like fighting gravity. I reached out with a trembling hand and pressed the silver intercom button on the console. pump 4 is out of order," I said, my voice cracking slightly. I cleared my throat and tried again, striving for an authoritative tone. "Please use another." I released the button, and I waited. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. The hum of the refrigerators seemed to fade into the background. I stared at the wood grain of the counter, tracing the lines with my eyes, silently begging for the sound of a starting engine or a car door slamming. Instead, I heard footsteps. But they weren't on the gravel by the pumps. They were on the wooden planks of the wraparound porch, directly outside the front windows. Thud, thud, thud. They were impossibly heavy. The wood groaned in protest, under a weight that sounded entirely too massive for a human being. The footsteps didn't sound like boots. They sounded like something solid and blunt striking the wood. They slowly paced along the length of the front windows, moving from right to left. I didn't move a muscle. I barely breathed. My eyes remained locked on the counter, but in my peripheral vision, I could see a shadow eclipsing the ambient light from the neon sign. Something incredibly tall was walking past the glass. It moved with a strange, jerky cadence, a bipedal gait that seemed unnatural, as if the thing walking hadn't quite mastered how legs were supposed to work. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the double glass doors. A slow, deliberate tapping began against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't the sound of knuckles. It sounded like thick, hardened bone clicking against the pane. "Hey," a voice called out from the other side of the glass. I clamped my eyes shut. The voice was wrong. It was perfectly clear, carrying easily through the thick glass in the rain, but it lacked any inflection or emotion. It sounded like a recording of a human voice being played through a slightly blown speaker. It sounded like an imitation. "Hey, the pump is broken. I need to come inside. Let me inside." Sweat beaded on my forehead, rolling down the side of my face. I gripped the edges of the counter so hard my knuckles turned white. "Do not look up. Do not look out the window." "Elias," the voice said. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't told anyone my name. My name tag was in my pocket. Arthur hadn't even given me one yet. "Elias," the voice repeated, the pitch suddenly shifting, dropping lower, vibrating with a guttural undertone that made the coffee in my mug tremble. "I know you are looking at the counter. Look up, Elias. Look at me." The tapping on the glass intensified, growing harder, faster, threatening to crack the pane. "Tap, tap, 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 tap. Look up. Look at my face," the voice demanded, now entirely dropping the human facade. It was a roar that seemed to consist of multiple overlapping tones scraping against my eardrums. I squeezed my eyes shut, silently counting the seconds, praying to whatever deity was listening for the nightmare to end. The temperature in the diner plummeted, the air growing instantly freezing. I could feel the malevolent intent radiating through the glass, a predatory hunger so thick it felt like a physical pressure against my chest. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the tapping stopped. The heavy, dragging footsteps returned, moving away from the door, descending the wooden steps of the porch and crunching onto the gravel. I listened as the sounds faded into the distance, swallowed by the fog and the heavy pines of the Blackwood Ridge. It took me another full 5 minutes before I found the courage to finally raise my head and look out the window. The fog was still swirling around the gas pumps. There were no cars. There was no one there. But as I walked over to the front doors on trembling legs, my heart sank. Pressed against the condensation on the outside of the glass, nearly 7 feet off the ground, was a handprint. It was massive, with fingers that were impossibly long and jointed in entirely the wrong places. Arthur hadn't been crazy. The rules weren't a joke. I wiped a layer of cold sweat from my brow, staring out into the impenetrable darkness of the tree line. It was only 2:15 a.m. I had 6 more hours until dawn. And out there, in the pitch-black wilderness, something had just learned my name. The metallic clack of the deadbolt sliding into place sounded like a gunshot in the suffocating quiet of the outpost. I pulled my hand back from the brass lock as if the metal had burned me. Outside, illuminated by the sickly yellow buzz of the neon sign, that massive, impossible handprint was slowly beginning to drip in the freezing rain. The fingers were grotesque, spider-like, and far too long. Whatever had just spoken my name with that hollow, synthesized voice was not human. My back hit the Formica counter. I wanted to run, but the fog outside was a solid, churning wall of white. I was trapped. My frantic gaze snapped to the laminated sheet of rules. Rule 4, never let the coffee pots go completely empty. The smell of fresh coffee covers the scent of human sweat. They have an incredible sense of smell. I was sweating cold bullets, broadcasting my terror like a beacon. I launched myself toward the coffee station, my hands shaking so violently I crushed the first paper filter. I grabbed another, tore open a foil packet of French roast with my teeth, and dumped the dark powder in. I didn't stop until 3 pots were brewing simultaneously, creating a frantic symphony of hissing steam. A heavy, suffocating blanket of coffee scent began to mask the metallic tang of my fear. I looked at the clock. 2:48 a.m. Then, 2 faint halos of light pierced the gloom outside. They materialized from the mist, solidifying into the bright beams of vehicle headlights. A heavy engine crawled into the gravel lot. I felt a profound, almost tear-inducing rush of relief. As the vehicle pulled up to the front doors, the neon light washed over the white and green decals. A Ford Explorer, complete with a light bar and the gold shield of the United States Forest Service. A park ranger. Thank God. Authority. The engine cut off. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a standard olive-drab tactical jacket and campaign hat stepped out into the torrential rain. He jogged up the wooden steps, reached for the double doors, and found them locked. He peered through the glass, spotting me, and offered a warm, incredibly human smile. He tapped on the glass with his knuckles. "Hey there," his voice called out, muffled but carrying a friendly Western drawl. "Looks like you locked up by mistake, buddy. Mind letting me in? It's freezing out here." "Coming," I yelled back, the tension draining from my muscles. I hurried to the door, my hand reaching for the deadbolt. My fingertips brushed the cold brass. Then, my brain slammed on the brakes. Rule 2. At some point, a ranger named Miller might come in. Look closely at the badge on his chest. If the bear on the badge is missing its eyes, do not unlock the door. The real Miller died 6 years ago. Whatever is wearing his face is still learning. I froze. My hand hovered an inch from the lock. The ranger frowned slightly. "Everything all right in there, son?" I swallowed hard, forcing my eyes downward. His uniform was immaculate. Too immaculate. The freezing rain was rolling off his jacket as if he were coated in a thin layer of invisible oil. I saw the brass nameplate, Miller. Cold panic flooded my veins. I forced my eyes to track left to the heavy gold shield pinned above his heart, a shield framing a tall pine tree. And standing in front of the tree, embossed in the brass, was a bear. I leaned forward, my face mere inches from the glass. The bear was there. The fur texture was perfect, but where the eyes should have been, 2 small dots of indented metal, there was absolutely nothing. The brass was completely smooth, blind. The illusion violently unraveled. I looked back up at Miller's face. It lacked pores or imperfections, looking like high-grade silicone stretched taut over a rigid frame. And his eyes, he hadn't blinked once. "Is there a problem, Elias?" Miller asked. The friendly drawl was gone. The tone had flattened completely, identically matching the hollow, synthesized voice from the gas pumps. "We're closed," I stammered, backing away. System failure. The sign says open 24/7, the thing replied, the sound vibrating directly inside my skull. Unlock the door, Elias. I can smell the coffee. Let me inside. Miller's smile dropped off his face completely into a deadpan vacancy. Then its jaw unhinged. The mouth opened far wider than humanly possible, the skin tearing at the corners without a drop of blood, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. It placed both palms flat against the glass. Unlock the door. I spun on my heel and sprinted behind the counter. Go to the kitchen and turn on the exhaust fan until he leaves. I threw my body against the swinging kitchen door, bursting into the dark stainless steel prep area. Behind me, the world exploded into violence. Bang! The entity struck the reinforced safety glass. I scrambled across the greasy floor, my eyes locking onto a heavy-duty electrical box near the back door. I grabbed the large red lever and threw it upward. A deafening, bass-heavy roar shook the walls. The commercial exhaust fan, mounted in the ceiling above the grill, screamed to life like a jet engine. It instantly began pulling the air out of the room, creating a miniature hurricane. I wedged myself tightly between the massive walk-in refrigerator and a storage shelf, clamping my hands over my ears. The slamming against the front door stopped. Then the kitchen ceiling groaned. Massive, thudding footsteps walked across the roof of the diner. It was looking for another way in. The footsteps stopped squarely above the stainless steel exhaust hood hanging over the grill. The kitchen lights flickered wildly and died, plunging me into pitch-black darkness. Above the roar of the fan, I heard the screech of rending metal. The entity was on the roof, tearing at the aluminum vent. Suddenly, a voice drifted down the ventilation shaft, cutting through the mechanical roar. It wasn't the flat voice of the ranger anymore. "Elias, honey, please open the door." It was my mother. The voice was flawless, the soft Boston accent, the slight tremor of worry. "It's so cold up here, Elias. They're hurting me. Open the door." Tears streamed down my face. She lived 3,000 miles away. I knew it was the creature, but the sound of her agony triggered a primal imperative to protect her. "Elias!" the voice shrieked, escalating into an inhuman, deafening screech that tore at my sanity. Screech. The heavy metal grate covering the inside of the exhaust hood buckled downward. The bolts popped like gunshots. A hand reached down through the vent. It was massive, gray and skeletal, the fingers tipped with bone-like claws. The hand descended directly into the spinning steel blades of the industrial exhaust fan. It didn't care. The heavy steel blades chopped into the creature's flesh with a sickening wet thud. Black, viscous fluid splattered violently against the stainless steel hood, raining down onto the grill. The fan engine whined, hacking into the dense muscle of the entity's arm, but the creature kept pushing deeper, its jagged fingers blindly groping the empty air in the dark kitchen. "Let me in," it roared in my mother's voice, mangled by the grinding fan. I panicked. My hands swept over a prep table, my fingers brushing the cold steel of a heavy meat cleaver. I grabbed it, raising it above my head, ready to hack at those grotesque fingers if they came an inch closer. For 10 agonizing seconds, it reached for me in the dark, black ichor spraying everywhere. And then, with a furious, frustrated roar that shook the building's foundation, the arm violently retracted. Heavy footsteps stomped across the roof, leaped off, and hit the soft forest earth with a massive thud. I stood alone in the dark kitchen. The exhaust fan chugged and wheezed, coated in thick black fluid. I waited 20 minutes before pushing the swinging door open. The diner lights were still on. The front doors held a massive spider web of shattered glass, but they hadn't broken. I looked at the clock. 3:54 a.m. I lowered the meat cleaver. The rules were keeping me alive, but the things and the Blackwood Ridge were testing the boundaries, and they were learning. The black ichor dripping from the industrial exhaust fan smelled like burning copper and rotting leaves. It pooled on the stainless steel flat-top grill, sizzling faintly where the pilot lights kept the metal warm. I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the diner, the heavy meat cleaver gripped so tightly in my right hand that my forearm cramped. The digital clock on the wall glared back at me, 4:12 a.m. I was officially in the graveyard hours, that deep, hollow stretch of the night where the human body begs for sleep and the mind starts playing tricks. Only the things out in the Blackwood Ridge weren't tricks. They were flesh, bone, and an ancient, calculating malice. I forced myself to move. I couldn't stay frozen. I grabbed a ragged bar towel, soaked it in bleach from a bucket under the counter, and began frantically scrubbing the black fluid off the grill. I didn't want to know what kind of biology produced blood that thick and dark. The bleach hissed, sending a toxic cloud of chemical vapor into the air, but I welcomed the harsh sting in my lungs. It proved I was still breathing. It proved I was still alive. I topped off the coffee pots, making sure the rich, roasted aroma continued to blanket the diner, fulfilling Rule 4. I poured myself a fresh mug, dumping in 3 packets of sugar to mask the bitterness, and drank it scalding hot. The caffeine hit my bloodstream like a jolt of electricity, wiring my frayed nerves even tighter. I took my coffee and my cleaver to the front counter, keeping a wide berth from the double doors. The spiderweb fracture in the safety glass was a terrifying reminder of how close the entity had come to breaching the outpost. Outside, the freezing rain continued its relentless drumbeat against the roof. The fog was a swirling, impenetrable soup, glowing a sickly mustard yellow beneath the flickering neon sign. I stared out into the mist, searching for shapes, for shadows. Nothing moved. 4:34 a.m. Screech! Crunch! The sound violently shattered the monotony of the rain. It came from the highway, just beyond the edge of the gravel lot, obscured entirely by the thick fog. It was the unmistakable, horrifying noise of a high-speed automotive collision, tires squealing desperately against wet asphalt, followed by the sickening crunch of crumpling metal and shattering glass. Then, a car horn began to blare, a steady, unbroken honk that echoed through the dense pines, signifying a driver slumped heavily against the steering wheel. "Oh my God," I breathed, my heart leaping into my throat. I dropped my coffee mug. It shattered on the linoleum, splashing dark liquid across my boots, but I barely noticed. I rushed toward the front windows, pressing my hands against the unbroken panes of glass, straining my eyes into the whiteout conditions. "Help!" The voice was faint, raw, and agonizing pain. It pierced through the sound of the blaring horn and the pouring rain. "Please!" "Is anyone there? Oh God, I can't feel my legs." It was a young woman, her voice cracked with genuine, unadulterated terror. The sound of it hooked directly into my morality, bypassing fear, bypassing logic. She was out there. Someone had missed the treacherous curve leading up to the outpost and wrapped their car around one of the massive redwoods lining the highway. "Help me! The car is smoking! Please, somebody!" I grabbed my heavy winter coat from beneath the register and shoved my arms into the sleeves. I grabbed the heavy military-grade Maglite flashlight I kept behind the counter. I had to get out there. I had to pull her out before the engine caught fire. I took a step toward the fractured double doors, my hand reaching for the deadbolt. Rule 3. If you hear someone calling your name from the tree line, even if it sounds exactly like me, your mother, or someone you love, turn on the exterior floodlights immediately. Do not step off the porch. They steal voices. They use them like bait. I stopped dead in my tracks. My boot hovered an inch above the floor tiles. "No," I whispered to myself, shaking my head violently. "No, that's a real person. That was a real crash." "Hello?" the girl screamed, her voice growing more frantic, more desperate. "I see the neon sign. I know the gas station is right there. Please, my baby's in the back seat. Please." A baby. A surge of adrenaline completely flooded my system. The rules be damned. Arthur O'Connor was a paranoid old fool, and if I stood here while a mother and child burned to death in a wrecked car 50 yards away, I would never be able to live with myself. I lunged for the door. "Elias, help us!" My hand hit the brass deadbolt, but I didn't turn it. The blood drained completely from my face, leaving my skin ice cold. Elias. She had called me Elias. How could a random motorist, stranded in a crashed car out on a fog-choked highway, possibly know the name of the night shift cashier working inside the outpost? The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The compassion that had propelled me toward the door instantly curdled into a bottomless, suffocating dread. The horn was still blaring. The rain was still falling. "Elias, the fire is spreading! Elias, please!" she shrieked. The agony was so flawless, so agonizingly human, it made my teeth ache. I backed away from the doors. My eyes darted to the heavy breaker box mounted on the wall behind the cash register. Arthur had shown it to me during my 10-minute orientation. The exterior floodlights. I lunged over the counter, scrambling to my feet, and ripped open the metal panel of the breaker box. I found a heavy switch labeled Xed perimeter/treeline and slammed it upward. A series of loud mechanical thunks echoed outside as the massive industrial halogen floodlights mounted to the roof of the outpost surged to life. The darkness outside was instantly annihilated. Brilliant, blinding white light sliced through the dense fog, illuminating the gravel lot, the gas pumps, and the jagged edge of the tree line where the ancient forest met the highway. I slowly stood up, looking over the counter and through the front windows. There was no crashed car. There was no smoke, no shattered glass on the asphalt, no trapped mother or crying baby. Standing exactly at the boundary line where the gravel ended and the wet, grasping ferns of the Blackwood Ridge began were 3 of them. My breath caught in my throat, coming out in a strangled wheeze. Seeing the handprint had been terrifying. Seeing the thing wearing Ranger Miller's face had been a psychological violation. But seeing them in their true forms, bathed in the unforgiving glare of the halogen lights, broke something fundamental inside my mind. They were impossibly tall, easily 8 or 9 feet, their bodies gaunt and emaciated, covered in taut ash-gray skin that looked like stretched parchment. Their limbs were elongated, ending in hands with too many joints and fingers that dragged the ground. But it was their faces that defied any natural biology. They had no distinct eyes, nose, or mouth, just a smooth, pale expanse of flesh that seemed to ripple and shift like maggots writhing beneath a sheet. One of them was holding a large, jagged piece of rusted sheet metal, probably scrap ripped from an abandoned logging truck deep in the woods. Another was holding a heavy iron crowbar. They were methodically, rhythmically scraping the metal objects together, producing a horrific mechanical squeal. Screech! Crunch! They were making the sound of the crash themselves. The third entity, standing slightly ahead of the others, had its head tilted back, its smooth, featureless face aimed toward the sky. Its throat expanded like a bullfrog's sack, vibrating violently. The sound of the blaring car horn, a perfect, unbroken "honk," was projecting directly from its pulsing throat. As the floodlights hit them, they froze. The scraping stopped. The blaring horn cut off abruptly, leaving an echoing ringing in my ears. Slowly, all 3 entities lowered their heads and turned to face the diner. Even without eyes, I could feel the crushing weight of their gaze piercing the glass, pinning me to the floor. They knew I was looking at them. They knew the trick had failed. The one in the front opened its face. The smooth skin split down the middle with a wet, tearing sound, revealing a vertical, gaping maw lined with rows of jagged, translucent teeth. "Elias," it whispered. The voice didn't carry through the air. It manifested directly inside my head, sounding exactly like my own voice. "You can't stay in the light forever." Without another sound, the three entities took a synchronized step backward, melting seamlessly into the dense black shadows of the pine trees, swallowed whole by the forest. I collapsed against the back counter, my legs giving out completely. I slid down the cabinets until I hit the linoleum floor, pulling my knees to my chest. I couldn't stop shaking. My teeth were chattering so violently I bit my lip, tasting blood. Tool use. They were using tools. They were coordinating. They were setting psychological traps designed specifically to exploit human empathy. They weren't just predators. They were hunters. I looked at the clock. 4:47 a.m. I still had over an hour until the sun even began to think about rising. I stayed on the floor for a long time, the meat cleaver resting on my lap, my eyes fixed on the cracked glass of the front doors. The halogen floodlights continued to bake the parking lot in white light, providing a fragile perimeter of safety. I closed my eyes, trying to regulate my breathing. The rain was slowing down, the heavy drumming on the metal roof tapering off into a soft, intermittent drizzle. Then, the drizzle stopped. I opened my eyes. I listened. The humming of the neon sign in the window flickered and died. The low, constant rumble of the commercial refrigerators in the kitchen ground to a halt. The hissing of the coffee makers silenced. The power hadn't gone out, the interior lights were still on, but the ambient noise of the building had simply vanished. I strained my ears. There was no wind howling through the massive pines outside. There was no sound of water dripping from the gutters. There were no crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of holly. It was a total, absolute, suffocating vacuum of sound. It was the kind of silence you experience deep underwater or buried under 10 feet of snow. The air pressure in the diners suddenly dropped, making my ears pop painfully. My blood ran cold. The final rule. Rule 5. If the woods ever go completely, perfectly silent, no wind, no crickets, no hum of the highway, hide in the walk-in freezer. Wait for the sound of scratching on the metal door to stop, then count to 100 before coming out. I scrambled to my feet, abandoning the meat cleaver on the floor. I didn't look out the windows. I didn't care if the floodlights were still on. If the woods went silent, it meant the entities weren't just hunting anymore. It meant something else had arrived, something much, much worse. I sprinted for the kitchen. I didn't look back. I hit the swing doors at a full run, bolting past the fryers and the grease-stained grill. At the back of the prep area stood the massive, heavy stainless steel door of the commercial walk-in freezer. I grabbed the heavy metal latch, pulled it down, and yanked the heavy door open. A blast of sub-zero air hit me in the face, smelling of frost and frozen meat. I threw myself inside, grabbing the interior release handle, and slammed the thick door shut behind me. Clang. The heavy seal engaged, locking me inside the dark, freezing metal box. I stumbled backward, hitting a rack of frozen hamburger patties, and slid to the icy floor. It was pitch black. The cold immediately began biting through my jacket, stinging my cheeks and numbing my fingers. I held my breath in the dark, straining to listen through the thick insulation of the freezer walls. For 10 seconds, there was nothing. And then it began. Screep. It was the sound of something unimaginably hard and sharp, dragging slowly down the outside of the stainless steel freezer door. Screep. It wasn't the frantic, chaotic assault of the mimic of the front glass. This was slow, deliberate, methodical. It was the sound of a predator that knew exactly where its prey was hiding and knew it had all the time in the world. I pulled my knees tight to my chest, burying my face in my arms, shivering violently in the sub-zero dark, and waited for the scratching to stop. The walk-in freezer was a tomb of frost and stainless steel. The darkness inside was absolute, a heavy, suffocating black that pressed against my eyeballs. The cold was an aggressive, living thing, instantly biting through my jacket and gnawing at my bones. My breath plumed in the freezing air, invisible but thick, creating a thin layer of frost on my eyelashes every time I blinked. I sat huddled on the grated floor, wedged between a stack of heavy boxes containing frozen French fries and the thick metal wall. I wrapped my arms tightly around my legs, trying to conserve whatever meager body heat I had left. Screep! The sound vibrated through the metal wall I was leaning against, rattling my teeth. It was a long, excruciatingly slow drag of something incredibly hard, like a diamond-tipped chisel, scoring the thick stainless steel of the heavy freezer door. It wasn't trying to break in, not yet. It was testing the material, savoring the hunt. Screep! I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my hands over my ears, but the sound bypassed my eardrums completely, resonating directly through the floor and into my skull. The sheer density of the noise suggested a creature of impossible mass. The entities I had seen at the tree line were tall and gaunt, but whatever was pacing outside the freezer door felt heavy enough to buckle the linoleum floor of the kitchen. My teeth began to chatter violently, a staccato clicking that felt deafening in the tight space. I tried to clamp my jaw shut, but the cold was rapidly stealing my muscle control. My fingers and toes were already going numb, a terrifying dull ache replacing the sharp sting of the freezing air. Rule 5. Hide in the walk-in freezer. Wait for the sound of scratching on the metal door to stop, then count to 100 before coming out. I focused all my remaining mental energy on those words. They were the only anchor I had left to reality. Another sound joined the agonizing scrape of claws on metal. It was a low, wet, rhythmic wheezing. The creature was breathing. The sound was thick with fluid, a bubbling, guttural respiration that sounded like air being forced through mud and rotting meat. I could hear it sniffing at the seam of the heavy freezer door, inhaling sharply, searching for the scent of my terror beneath the overpowering smell of the coffee I had brewed. Suddenly, the scraping stopped. The heavy, wet breathing ceased. The silence returned, absolute and crushing. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped animal trying to escape its cage. Had it given up? Had it left? I squeezed my eyes shut tighter in the pitch black and began to count in my head, my jaw locked to stop the chattering. 1, 2, 3. The cold was becoming unbearable. My body began to shake with violent, uncontrollable tremors. The core temperature of my blood was dropping dangerously fast. I knew the signs of hypothermia. I knew that if I stayed in here too long, the shivering would eventually stop, replaced by a deadly, lethargic warmth. I couldn't let that happen. 45, 46, 47. The silence outside the door remained unbroken. Not a footstep, not a breath. 70, 71, 72. My mind began to play tricks. In the absolute sensory deprivation of the freezing dark, I started seeing flashes of pale, featureless faces swimming in the blackness behind my eyelids. I heard the phantom echoes of my mother's agonizing screams, bouncing around the frozen metal walls. The urge to burst out of the freezer, to escape the paralyzing cold and face whatever nightmare waited in the kitchen was nearly overwhelming. 98, 99, 100. I stopped counting. I opened my eyes into the pitch black. The silence was total. I uncurled my legs. My joints popped loudly, stiff and agonizingly painful. I dragged myself up using the metal helving, my numb fingers clumsy and weak. It took immense effort just to stand upright. I shuffled toward the front of the freezer, extending my hands blindly until my fingertips brushed the frost-coated metal of the heavy door. I found the interior release handle. It was a thick, plastic-coated lever designed to prevent anyone from getting accidentally locked inside. It felt like a block of solid ice. I gripped the handle with both hands. I pressed my ear against the freezing metal door, straining to hear anything in the kitchen outside. Nothing. I took a deep, shaky breath of the sub-zero air, braced my boots against the grated floor, and pushed down on the handle. The heavy latch disengaged with a loud thwack that echoed like a gunshot. I pushed the heavy door open just an inch. A sliver of dim, ambient light from the diner spilled into the dark freezer, accompanied by a blast of warm, grease-scented air. It felt like a tropical breeze against my frost-bitten skin. I peered through the narrow crack. The kitchen was empty. The lights were still out, but I could see the outline of the fryers and the grill, illuminated by the glow from the front windows. There was no massive shadow waiting for me. I pushed the door open wider and stepped out into the kitchen. My legs were weak and shaky, almost giving out beneath me. I leaned heavily against the walk-in door, slamming it shut behind me. The sudden warmth of the kitchen air hit me, and I began to shiver violently, the blood rushing painfully back into my extremities. I looked at the heavy stainless steel door of the freezer. The exterior was gouged with deep, parallel scratches that cut straight through the thick metal, exposing the insulation beneath. It looked as if a giant grizzly bear had spent hours trying to dig its way through a bank vault. I slowly turned away from the door and hobbled toward the swinging door that led to the diner. Every step was agonizing, my frozen boots heavy and clumsy. I pushed the swinging door open and stepped back out to the front counter. The lights were on. The coffee machines were hissing softly. The digital clock on the wall read 5:14 a.m. I had survived. I had followed the rules, and I was still alive. Dawn was approaching. The sun would be up soon, bringing light, sanity, and an end to the nightmare. I staggered toward the front counter, intending to pour myself a massive cup of hot coffee to thaw the ice from my veins. I kept my eyes focused on the floor, trying to ignore the fractured spider web of safety glass on the front doors. "Rough night, Elias?" The voice came from the diner. It wasn't the flat, synthesized voice of the mimic. It wasn't the agonizing scream from the vent. It was calm. It was casual. It was deeply, terrifyingly human. I froze. My head snapped up. Sitting in one of the red vinyl booths near the front windows, casually sipping from a ceramic coffee mug, was a man. He looked entirely normal. He wore a heavy plaid flannel shirt, worn denim jeans, and thick leather work boots. A faded baseball cap sat on his head. He looked like any average logger or trucker who might frequent the outpost. He had rugged features, a dusting of stubble on his jaw, and warm brown eyes. But I hadn't heard the door chime. The front doors were still locked, and I hadn't made him that coffee. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the man said, offering a small, sympathetic smile. "Or worse. Come on, sit down. The coffee's good. You make a strong pot." I backed away slowly, my hand instinctively reaching for the heavy meat cleaver I had abandoned on the floor earlier. My fingers found the cold steel handle, and I gripped it tight. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice hoarse and trembling. "How did you get in here?" The man chuckled, a rich, genuine sound. He took another sip of coffee and set the mug down on the Formica table. "I've always been here, Elias. Long before O'Connor put up this little box of lights. Long before the highway. He wasn't a mimic. The mimics stole voices, they stole faces, but they couldn't replicate the subtle nuances of human emotion. This man wasn't an imitation. He was something else entirely. "I don't care," I said, raising the cleaver slightly, trying to project a threat I absolutely did not feel. "We're closed. Get out." The man sighed, leaning back against the vinyl booth. "You followed the rules. You survived the night. That's impressive. Most of O'Connor's new hires don't make it past the first hour. They panic, they run out into the fog, or they open the door for the ranger." He looked at me with an expression of mild amusement. "But you're different. You're careful. You're smart. That's why I wanted to talk to you before the sun comes up." "I have nothing to say to you," I spat, my grip tightening on the cleaver. "Oh, but I think you do," the man replied, his tone remaining infuriatingly calm. "You see, Arthur's rules are very effective at keeping you alive against the foot soldiers, so to speak. The hungry ones, the mimics. They're feral. They hunt by instinct." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, fixing me with an intense, unblinking stare. The warmth in his brown eyes vanished, replaced by an ancient, chilling emptiness. "But the rules won't protect you from me, Elias, because I don't follow rules. I make them." The temperature in the diner, which had just begun to feel warm after my time in the freezer, suddenly plummeted again. The air grew heavy, thick with a sudden, suffocating pressure. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered wildly, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance and twist on the walls. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sudden violent humming of the neon sign in the window. The man smiled, revealing teeth that were perfectly white, but slightly too sharp. "I want to offer you a new job," he said smoothly. "Arthur is old, Elias. He's tired. He's been guarding this boundary line for decades, and he's losing his edge. He relies on his little laminated sheet of paper, but the Blackwood Ridge is waking up. The things in the deep woods are getting restless. They're hungry." He stood up slowly from the booth. As he moved, his shadow didn't move with him. It stretched across the diner floor, elongating and twisting into a massive, jagged shape that resembled the monstrous entity I had seen at the tree line. "You've proven yourself tonight," he continued, taking a step toward me. "You have the instinct to survive. I can offer you protection, Elias. Real protection. You won't have to hide in freezers. You won't have to cower behind locked doors. You can walk the woods at night, and nothing will touch you." "What's the catch?" I asked, backing away until my shoulders hit the coffee machines. "No catch," he lied, the false sincerity dripping from his words. "Just a change of management. You stop following Arthur's rules. You open the doors. You let us in, just for one night." He stopped a few feet away from me. The illusion of the normal man was fracturing at the edges. His skin seemed to ripple slightly, and the air around him blurred as if he were generating intense heat. "If you refuse," he said, his voice dropping into a guttural, vibrating tone that rattled the coffee pots, "the next time the woods go silent, the freezer door won't hold. I will peel it open like a tin can, and I will show you what the cold really feels like." I stared at him, my heart hammering in my chest. The temptation to give in, to escape the relentless terror was strong, but I looked at the deep gouges on the freezer door. I remembered the agonizing screams of my mother pouring from the vent. I remembered the blind bear on the ranger's badge. They weren't offering protection. They were offering surrender. "No," I said firmly, my voice steadier than I felt. I raised the meat cleaver, pointing the heavy blade directly at his chest. "I follow the rules." The entity's expression darkened. The illusion of humanity dropped entirely, revealing a face of smooth ash-gray skin, devoid of eyes or a nose, its gaping maw lined with jagged, translucent teeth. It let out a deafening, inhuman shriek of pure rage that shattered the remaining coffee pots, sending boiling liquid and glass raining down around me. It lunged forward, its massive clawed hands reaching for my throat, but it was too late. The first gray light of dawn broke over the horizon, piercing through the dense fog of the Blackwood Ridge. The sunlight hit the fractured glass of the front doors, casting a weak, pale beam into the diner. As the light touched the entity, it shrieked in agony. Its physical form began to dissolve, smoking and hissing like acid hitting flesh. It thrashed violently, its elongated limbs grasping desperately at the air before collapsing into a pile of dark, foul-smelling ash on the linoleum floor. I dropped the meat cleaver, my chest heaving, the adrenaline draining rapidly from my system. I slumped against the counter, sliding down to the floor, surrounded by broken glass and spilled coffee. The digital clock on the wall ticked over to 6 a.m. The front doors unlocked with a loud click. Arthur O'Connor walked in, wiping his boots on the mat. He looked around the diner, at the shattered coffee pots, the cracked front doors, the deep gouges on the freezer, and finally at the pile of ash on the floor. He walked over to the counter, picked up the laminated sheet of rules, and wiped a drop of spilled coffee off the plastic. "I see you met the management," Arthur grunted, looking down at me with a grim, hard expression. "You survived the night, Elias." He tossed an apron onto my lap. "Grab a broom," he said gruffly. "Your shift starts again at 10 tonight." I didn't run. I didn't quit. Maybe it was a twisted form of Stockholm Syndrome, or maybe, deep down in the fractured pieces of my psyche, I realized that if I ran, I'd be leaving the rest of the world completely blind to the nightmare festering in the Blackwood Ridge. Whatever the reason, I kept showing up. 3 weeks passed. I memorized the laminated sheet of rules until they were burned into my retinas. I learned to distinguish the mechanical, hollow thud of a mimic from the heavy, wet crunch of a genuine trucker's boots on the gravel. I learned to pour boiling coffee without shaking when my dead father's voice whispered to me from the dark corners of the parking lot. I became a machine, built for the sole purpose of surviving from dusk until dawn. But tonight was different. It was the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. Arthur O'Connor didn't leave at 10 p.m. Instead, he locked the front doors, flipped the neon open sign to closed, and pulled down heavy, corrugated steel shutters over the front windows, shutters I hadn't even known existed. "They don't like the cold, Elias," Arthur grunted, pulling a heavy canvas duffel bag from beneath the counter and dropping it onto the linoleum with a metallic clank. "But they hate the light even more, and tonight the sun is gone for 15 hours. Tonight, they don't just test the boundary line. They try to erase it." I watched as the old man unzipped the bag. It wasn't filled with coffee beans or spare receipt paper. It was packed with heavy-duty road flares, several high-lumen tactical flashlights, and a pump-action shotgun. Beside the shotgun were dozens of strange, custom-looking shells. "Magnesium and white phosphorus," Arthur said, catching my stare. "Burns at 4,000 degrees, blinding bright. It won't kill the big ones, but it hurts them enough to make them think twice." He tossed me a flare and a heavy steel flashlight. "Put these in your pockets. If the main power goes, the backup generator in the shed will kick in. But if they take out the generator, we have exactly 3 minutes before the darkness lets them slip right through the walls." "Slip through the walls?" I echoed, my mouth growing dry. "Arthur, you said if we follow the rules, we're safe." "The rules are for a normal night," he replied grimly, racking a shell into the chamber of the shotgun. "Tonight is a siege. The entity you met 3 weeks ago, the one offering you a deal, it wasn't lying about one thing. I am getting old. They know it. They're gonna push with everything they have. The digital clock above the kitchen door read 11:45 p.m. The temperature inside the diner began to plummet, our breath pluming into white clouds. And then the silence fell. It didn't happen gradually. It was an instantaneous, suffocating vacuum. The hum of the refrigerators died. The wind outside ceased to exist. My ears popped painfully. It was Rule 5, but magnified 100-fold. The oppressive weight of the silence was so heavy it made my knees buckle. "The freezer won't hold them tonight," Arthur said, his voice sounding thin and weak in the dead air. "Stand your ground behind the counter." Boom! The entire building shuddered. Dust rained down from the ceiling tiles. It wasn't a knock, it was a battering ram. Boom! The steel shutters over the front windows groaned, bowing inward. Whatever was out there had abandoned the psychological tricks. There were no fake voices, no crying babies, no mimicry. This was raw, brute force. "Arthur?" I panicked, gripping the heavy flashlight like a club. "How many are out there?" "All of them," he whispered. Boom! Screech! The heavy steel shutters over the front doors violently tore away from their hinges, ripping chunks of the wooden doorframe with them. The reinforced safety glass shattered into a million glittering diamonds, exploding inward across the diner. The freezing winter wind howled into the outpost, carrying with it a smell so foul I gagged, a mix of rotting ozone, stagnant water, and ancient, decayed earth. Through the gaping hole where the doors used to be, the darkness of the Blackwood Ridge poured in. And within that darkness, they moved. Scores of them. They were gaunt, towering silhouettes with elongated limbs and pale, featureless faces. They crawled over the gravel lot like a swarm of impossible, starved insects. Some walked on two legs, others scrambled on all fours, their joints popping and cracking in a horrific symphony. At the center of the swarm, stepping over the threshold of the ruined doors, was the entity from my first week. The manager. It had abandoned the human guise entirely. It stood 9 feet tall, its ash-gray skin pulled taut over a skeletal frame. Its face was a smooth, eyeless canvas, split down the middle by a gaping maw of translucent, needle-like teeth. O'Connor, the entity's voice projected directly into our skulls, a collective vibrating frequency that made my nose bleed. "Go to hell!" Arthur roared. He raised the shotgun and fired. The blast was deafening in the confined space. The magnesium shell exploded from the barrel in a blinding streak of pure, white-hot light. It struck the lead entity square in the chest. The creature shrieked, a high, piercing sound of pure agony that shattered the remaining coffee pots on the counter. The magnesium flared brilliantly, burning into the entity's flesh with a blinding intensity. The surrounding creatures hissed and scrambled backward, shielding their featureless faces from the searing light. "Elias! The basement!" Arthur yelled, pumping another shell into the chamber. "The red switch at the bottom of the stairs! The red switch!" "I'm not leaving you!" I shouted over the chaotic shrieking of the horde. "Go!" Arthur shoved me hard toward the kitchen doors. "The red switch is the stadium array. It's wired to a separate grid deep underground. Do it, kid. Burn 'em out." I stumbled backward, pushing through the swinging doors into the dark kitchen. I heard the shotgun roar again, followed by a chorus of inhuman shrieks and a sickening sound of metal tearing. I bolted past the fryers and the walk-in freezer, throwing open the heavy wooden door that led down into the basement. It was a narrow, steep staircase plunging into absolute darkness. I clicked on the heavy flashlight, its beam cutting through the dust, and practically threw myself down the steps. Above me, the sounds of battle were horrifying. The shotgun fired a third time, then a fourth, but interspersed with the blasts were the sounds of heavy tables being smashed, metal ripping, and Arthur screaming. I hit the concrete floor of the basement. My flashlight beam swept wildly across the damp walls, illuminating stacks of old inventory boxes, spare parts, and cobwebs. Where is it? Where is it? My beam caught a massive industrial gray metal box mounted to the far concrete wall. It looked like something out of a Cold War bunker. Painted on the front in faded red letters were the words, "Emergency Override." I sprinted toward it, my boots slipping on the damp concrete. I threw open the metal panel. Inside was a single, massive switch with a heavy rubber handle. It was wrapped in thick yellow caution tape. From the ceiling above, the sound of the shotgun stopped. There was a dull, heavy thud, followed by a wet, tearing noise. "Arthur!" I screamed. "Flip it, kid!" Arthur's voice drifted down, weak, bubbling with blood, but defiant to the last syllable. I grabbed the heavy rubber handle with both hands. I braced my boots against the wall, closed my eyes, and pulled it down with every ounce of strength I had left in my body. A massive, deep thrumming sound vibrated through the very foundation of the outpost. It felt like an earthquake. The concrete trembled beneath my feet as massive capacitors, buried deep beneath the earth, discharged their stored energy all at once. From above, the shrieks of the entities didn't just escalate, they multiplied into a deafening choir of absolute burning agony. I scrambled back up the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears. I burst through the kitchen doors and staggered into the diner. I was instantly blinded. The entire outpost was bathed in a light so intense it felt physical. Massive, stadium-grade ultraviolet halogen arrays, hidden within the rafters, beneath the eaves, and mounted on the roof, had ignited simultaneously. The diner was brighter than the surface of the sun. Through squinted, watering eyes, I saw them burning. The entities trapped inside the diner were dissolving. Their ash-gray skin smoked, bubbled, and sloughed off their elongated bones. They thrashed wildly, their limbs flailing as the pure, concentrated ultraviolet light broke down their unnatural biology. The swarm in the parking lot had scattered, fleeing back into the tree line like cockroaches scattering from a flashlight, their shrieks fading into the deep woods. The lead entity, the manager, was pinned near the front counter. It was smoking heavily, its form wavering and collapsing in on itself. It turned its gaping, eyeless face toward me one last time, a look of profound, ancient hatred burning across the psychic link before it finally disintegrated into a mound of foul black ash. The light continued to burn, searing the darkness away, purifying the blood-stained linoleum. I fell to my knees, shielding my eyes. When my vision finally adjusted, I looked behind the counter. Arthur O'Connor was gone. There was a pool of dark blood, a shattered shotgun, and a burned-out road flare, but his body was gone. Dragged away in the final seconds or consumed by the light, I would never know. I sat alone on the floor of the ruined diner as the digital clock on the wall slowly ticked forward. 2 years later, the neon sign buzzed with a comforting, familiar hum. O'Connor's Outpost, open 24/7. The diner had been rebuilt. The doors were reinforced steel now, and the glass was ballistic grade. The halogen arrays remained hidden in the eaves, wired to a dead man's switch I kept under the counter. I wiped down the formica tables, restocked the napkin dispensers, and checked the coffee pots. They were full, emitting the rich, earthy scent of French roast that blanketed the outpost. I was 26 now, but my eyes in the mirror belonged to a man twice my age. My hair was graying at the temples. I moved with a deliberate, calculated efficiency. The bell chimed. A young kid, maybe 19, walked through the doors. He looked nervous, shaking the rain from his cheap jacket, carrying a duffel bag that looked like it held everything he owned in the world. He had the desperate, hungry look of someone running away from something they couldn't face. I knew that look. I used to wear it. "Excuse me," the kid said, his voice trembling slightly. "I saw the sign in the window. Night shift wanted. I really need a job." I stopped wiping the counter and looked at him. I evaluated him, checking his posture, the steadiness of his gaze. "The pay is good," I said, my voice low and gravelly, surprising even myself with how much I sounded like Arthur. "But it's not a normal convenience store. It gets quiet out here. Too quiet. And when the quiet breaks, you have to be ready." "I can handle quiet," the kid said, puffing out his chest a little. "I'm not scared of the dark." "You should be," I replied. I reached beneath the register. I didn't pull out Arthur's old yellowed piece of paper. It had been destroyed in the fire of the stadium lights. Instead, I pulled out a brand new, heavily laminated sheet of paper. I had typed it out myself on a vintage typewriter I found in the basement. I slapped it onto the counter between us. "These are the rules," I said, my tone completely devoid of humor. "I don't care what you believe in. You follow them to the letter. If you don't, you won't just lose your job." The kid looked down at the list, his eyes scanning the first line. Elias's outpost, night shift protocol. Rule 1. If the bell for pump 4 rings after 2 a.m. I watched him read, seeing the exact moment the skeptical smile twitched at the corner of his mouth. He thought it was a joke. He thought I was a crazy mountain man. I reached across the counter, my calloused hand gripping his wrist with ironclad strength. "Look at my eyes, kid," I whispered, the absolute sincerity in my voice sending a visible chill down his spine. "There are things in the Blackwood Ridge that science hasn't categorized yet. They mimic us, they study us, and they are always hungry." I let go of his wrist, grabbing my heavy coat from the hook on the wall. "Follow the damn rules," I told him, walking toward the door. "I'll be back at 6 a.m. to relieve you." I stepped out into the freezing fog of the Pacific Northwest, leaving the kid alone in the yellow light. The woods were dark, ancient, and watching, but they wouldn't cross the boundary line tonight. Not on my watch.